So now we're going to do the Q&A here, and I'm sure people here have got a whole lot of good questions stored up. Mr. Intille, I think you're a little pessimistic about this idea of not, needing millions of people to participate in this and just getting a handful of volunteers, because that wasn't quite the point I was making. If you look at things like the way we all just let Google track our traffic patterns, millions of people do that. And I think you could potentially have millions of people willing to do it if they thought their information would be secure. But I wanted to ask a somewhat different question. When you're trying to measure behavior and particularly emotions, doesn't culture come into it? I mean, have you heard those stories where they say that one of the problems with studies is that a lot of the studies are performed on college students because that's the only people the scientists can find? And so the studies tell you nothing about what real people in the real world actually do?
Well, that's more psychologists maybe than the health researchers.
Well, I don't know. I mean, come on. How many of us do beer bongs? I mean, most of us of my age don't do that kind of stuff. So you don't want to just study college students. But what I wanted to ask is, I guess to all three of you, with all of the stuff that you're looking at, to what extent does culture matter? To what extent do you do research and say, I can't just do this looking at Americans. I might want to do the same thing looking at Japanese. I might want to do the same things looking at South Africans. To what extent does that matter in terms of how you get, what kind of readings you get in terms of the emotional interaction?
I can start commenting on that. Mm-hmm. I think that's an extremely important point. And speaking from experience at grad school, I ran a study in Egypt, Hokkaido, Japan, Kyoto, and some other parts of the Middle East for various reasons. And it was absolutely fascinating to see how the whole process of experimentation is construed as something different in different cultures. I mean, people in Egypt were just suspicious of us. It's like, why are you trying to learn about me? I mean, that's at a very basic level. Why are you even interested in learning about my behavior in the first place? And that was prevalent in the Middle East. And for instance, what we saw in Japan was people, when they were being measured, were trying to be much more normative. It's like, you don't want to stand out, even though you might. And these are horrible generalizations. I think it's much more granular than that. But that's what I could observe statistically at that level. And I think we probably don't want to assume universals, and I think we've been doing that a lot, perhaps for simplicity. I think as tools become more available at larger and larger scales, I don't exactly know how that's going to happen. I would love to see a world where it's not like emotion, but then context. It's like, well, context and, and everything is contextual. So I think that's still some ways to go, but the Internet of Things landscape might actually be one way in which that might start to happen.
If I could just add, so I actually think culture is very important as a context. I think, though, there's a tendency to overgeneralize what that means. I mean, we know, even in genes within the same race, there's more variability within one race than there is between a separate race. And I think you're going to find that same amount of variability in these different cultures. And if all you're doing is checking a box, and I'm not asking about introversion versus extroversion or locus of control or what sort of my stress profile is, then I have very limited information to tease out these potentially important variables. So I think if you had more measures of context at the level of individuals over time, we would probably better appreciate the significance of your observation that it matters.
Okay. So I guess we should be taking questions from the assembled multitude. I don't see any hands going up. There's one.
So this is a question for Stephen. I like the idea of these citizen scientists that sort of putting people to collect data. I wonder, do you think you could go even further and sort of start putting data back out to people that would allow more people to sort of answer and explore large data sets?
Well, I'd like to see multiple researchers using the same data sets more, perhaps, than you often do. And at least within health, there's some, I wouldn't say a reluctance to share the data, but it's enough barriers are set up where data is often not shared. So there's sort of this culture of collecting it, and then you use it, and then it doesn't, other people aren't necessarily doing more analysis on it. And I think that's something that we'd like to see changed. And by having really large data sets that are very interesting, you're going to attract people to them. And I think that's one way to get that type of system going, sort of expectation about what people should do going.
Oh,
Yeah, this is a question for Emre. So I know you were talking about trying to disambiguate the meaning of a word like predictable movie versus predictable something else based on the words around it. That makes great sense to me. That's done across people. So I'm wondering, is there any sense of trying to even more disambiguate meaning based on individual uses of words? So always scanning my language, because I may use language very differently than my 11-year-old daughter would use it. And if you can do that, what are the ethical concerns about that? Because you could use that information to target marketing pitches, et cetera.
Right, that's a great question, and actually, a lot of it is already done in tools that we use day to day.
Yeah.
So actually, as long as you have whatever the categorization is. Now, what I described there was restaurants versus finance or something like that. Well, as long as you have multiple data points from the individual with ratings, you can do that. Like if I have 10 statements from you and 10 statements from another person about restaurants and finance, machine learning allows me to do that. What I can't do is if I just have one statement from you with a rating. So the sort of the technology is there. Now, with regards to ethical concerns, I think this kind of optimization is done across the board in tools we use day to day. And
My Google ad showed me what I was last looking for.
Right,
Oh,
and I mean
yeah.
it's the whole notion of contextual analysis and terms like lifetime value marketing. So there's this notion of lifetime value which is emerging more and more, I think, in Silicon Valley. Before it was trying to predict what you did based on sort of a short-term memory of what you did. Now more and more there's information that is longitudinal about you. And so with purchase decisions like cars, perhaps you want to have a lifetime value assessment rather than moment-to-moment click-through behavior in your assessment. So I think with regards to ethical considerations, being tracked without my permission gets on my nerves. But I think that's just the reality of the finances behind how building a community translates into an asset. So there's the good and the bad. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating that without paying any money, we have tools that allow us to share our photos with the world, make everything accessible in ways that was not foreseeable. I can see my cousins in Cyprus and what they do like within seconds. You know, that's amazing technology. Now, I think this is sort of going back to our earlier discussion of the uncanny valley. I think some of these things will stabilize because ultimately we're still at sort of the excited stage of all this. I think as things mature, people are going to become more and more selective about having systems that respect the privacy in more meaningful and complex ways. So that's me doing positive psychology, I guess. But that would be my answer.
You take one from this side.
Just to build on what you just said, something about that they're getting all the data for free that you can see your cousins in Cyprus, and thinking about getting data from volunteer scientists. I wonder if you guys could comment a little bit about the economics of the science and the research. On the graphic of an NIH meeting, and thinking about the concentration of a lot of funding into small grants where we have pressure to collect data quickly from small samples and publish. This seems like a sea change in how we would do science. And just thinking about would we want to start compensating people who donate their data? Could we somehow open up the economics of this to sort of really reap the benefits of this sort of big data approach that you guys some of you are advocating for? You guys think?
It's a broad good question. I guess if you have a big resource that's interesting enough, you're going to attract people like engineers to start working on it, and that includes people at relatively junior levels in some cases. And so you see that with competitions and things like that are out there with some existing data sets, and sometimes a lot of innovation comes from that. Anything that becomes valuable enough, at some point people start trying to make money off of it, right? And I don't, long term, how you would manage a resource like that if you had lots of people participating, I don't know. And then make sure that it didn't become something that people felt wasn't for the sake of science and was more for the sake of business, it would be dangerous, right? Because all of this stuff that understands your behavior can be used on the business side for exactly those sorts of reasons. And in fact, it is, right? They want to do this too. And I guess my point on it all is we should not forget that we can potentially do amazing things in science with these sorts of data sets as long as we make sure people understand their participation, protect the privacy, protect the security of the data as best as possible, and that I think we can develop something where there's an acceptable level of risk so that a large number of people will probably participate with very minimal compensation. if they feel like it's really leading to major scientific discoveries.
I'd say too, in the health arena, combining these two responses, I think meaningful use, so having reimbursement based on outcomes, is going to really make a shift in what kind of technologies come to market, what gets sustained, and who pays for them.
Just to follow up, sorry. There's Twitter. I have a quick comment to make. I think one thing that's really happening that's fascinating with the companies coming out of Silicon Valley is attention is all of a sudden a resource on which economies are being built. So we didn't really have that established before. People can make money off of what I look at. And that's a new resource that we're tapping into. Now, the supply-demand curve for that is kind of forming right now. And it will form more granularly the more options for attention allocation we have. If I have multiple places that I can attend to, then you can create a competitive landscape. Now, if there's one place that you can attend to, you don't really have the economy. So I think moving forward, multiple pieces will start having meaningful ways of acquiring our attention. I mean, that's my thought.
Well, did you have a question from email?
We do. We have a question from Twitter using the hashtag Emotech. It's specifically posed to Matthew Goodwin. The question is, what are you seeing in co-regulation of biometric data between student and teacher, and why is this important?
That's a great question. I'll do this first, my response.
Oh, by the way, before you answer, if there's anybody else out there, remember it's hashtag Emotech. So go ahead and send more questions.
So what actually got us even interested in asking this question was this observation that there seems to be therapeutic rapport between some teachers and students that doesn't seem to be consistent across teachers and across all students. And I think there are different matches to people's, and I don't know what it is, if it's physical appearance, if it's their warmth, if it's their sternness, their style. I mean, there's something that seems to, a student's behavior can be more or less easily modified depending on the style of the teacher who's working with them, and vice versa. Some teachers have a certain affinity for some kinds of kids and some kinds of behaviors. That's a very complex space. So one of the things we were trying to do was just see, could we reduce down to something that could be measured in both of them, that sort of maybe a little easier to interpret, and that is, are they coordinated or are they discoordinated in their physiological profile? And if they are coordinated, whose physiological pattern is changing that's preceding the others. So if the teacher's arousal is changing and then the child starts to entrain or approximate the teacher, that's probably what you want in a therapeutic situation. If the child's arousal is getting out of control and now the teacher's arousal is following that, then that teacher probably is not in the best state to help this child regulate. So think about the other person as a proxy for that student's regulation. So I think those are really the two reasons why we started looking at it. And what we're finding is certain dyads seem to perform better than other dyads. And as we get more data, we'd like to see if we can't make a prediction about what that therapeutic rapport outcome is going to be based on a quantitative measure that we can save the time of, let's try 6 months with this pair, it didn't go well, now we'll switch to a different teacher, where all this sort of undesirable learning could be taking place.
Yeah.
I asked a question about the intersection between these wonderful novel forms of data collection and machine learning, sort of that rides on top of them. In the process of finding algorithmic fits for this data, starting with a very naive, just let the system do the kind of machine learning processes that are naive, you can end up in a situation in which you find statistically meaningful correlations, but that they don't conform to human narratives of causality, right? Why this works in this particular set of constellation of factors, it may not be legible to us. Because, what I think is interesting, particularly about Stephen and Matthew, but for all of you, is you're talking about dragging insights back into some kind of human construct about narratives of causality, and particularly in patient populations where the role of parents and teachers is so intimately connected. I just wonder about how we resolve that.
My guess is we're going to have very different answers as an engineer and as a psychologist. And as a psychologist, I'd like to let the engineer go first.
Well, so I'm in computer science and in health sciences here, and I like the fact that I'm split because I'm thinking about health behavior and how to measure it and how to intervene. But where the health pushes back on the computer science is that in much of machine learning, you get a big data set, you learn over it, and then you spit out the results, right? And then you just run your system. And I don't think that's going to work here. I think there's enough individuality among all our behavior that the machine learning algorithms have to be customized to the individual. And that's why I'm fixated on real time, right? So I want it to run in real time so that when it breaks, we can then figure out how do we create the human-computer interaction system that will fix it. And that's where this really might, ultimately tie back to Maggie and everybody who's working in the space of building these animated agents and that type of stuff, because the machine learning is going to break, and then the person has to fix it, and they don't have a PhD in machine learning, right? So what do? And we don't know how to answer that question very well, I don't think.
Okay, I think it's this side of the room.
Let me just, if I may,
Oh,
just
okay.
so I'm thinking also about natural observation, generating hypotheses to narrow the space. There's biological plausibility. There is something that you can, not a straw man hypothesis. This is what I think this is better. I could hierarchically rank what I think is most likely going to happen or is the explanation. But my understanding of a lot of the machine learning work is it's really about detection, categorization, and retrieval. And I think in psychology, what we're trying to do is forecast, make predictions, and then see, with some level of effect size about how much variance did we explain, and let that decide what's right or not right. One of the things that I get a little bit worried about is we can have all this data, we can throw a support vector machine at it, we're going to get an answer, and now we're starting to make up stories to explain that data. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's a happy medium because there's discovery there, but factor analysis, as an example, is as much art as it is science, and we're constrained by semantics.
Well, by the way, I just noticed you are eating your own dog food there. I didn't see the sensor on your wrist until now.
It's an interesting example, or a way to say that. Yeah, I'm wearing my sensor, but I'd like to hear what Lisa has to say.
Yeah, so what is that measuring, by the way?
That's what I was showing before, the
right.
electrodromal activity,
Right, gotcha.
temperature, and...
Mm-hmm. So you're actually making sure you follow yourself.
Oh, yeah, I won't ask anybody to do something I haven't done myself.
Absolutely, outstanding. Okay, there's somebody over here had a hand up.
Will you remember? If we can just take one follow-on comment.
No problem.
I don't have a microphone, but I was just going to say, I think the fact that there might be idiographic or person-specific patterns or causal links actually already violates one of the causal stories that we have in psychology. We imagine ourselves to be much more like physicists than biologists. And as a consequence, we're looking for nomothetic rules. We're looking for laws, causal laws that apply to all individuals in a universal way. And that, I think one of the things that these kinds of data and approaches reveal to us is that we can find it and we can find what looks like a universal rule or law, a causal link that applies to everyone under all conditions. But most likely that's artificial. And that when we try to then go and apply it, it won't work. I think these kinds of data reveal to us that some of the causal narratives that we have about how the mind works and how it relates to behavior are probably rooted in a kind of essentialism that's been with us for a really long time in science, and that we really have to get rid of. And I think that there are some really good examples in biology, for example, where they have done that. So I think the data are going to lead people. Some people will try the Procrustean route of trying to take the data and force it into the constructs they have. But I think there are always going to be some people who look at the data and say, this is a hypothesis generation opportunity. This is an opportunity to think of a new construct or a new causal story that then I can go and test. And that's where methodological innovation really spurs scientific innovation.
By the way, can I ask a question? Because everything you're saying is just kicking all this stuff off in my head. Do we ever get to the point where this becomes the norm for all of us? You hear people talking about personalized medicine. Maybe we get to the point where you have personalized emotional tracking so that you put these sensors on everybody and actually record who they are.
Yeah.
Does that ever happen?
That's what we've been trying to do for the past. I wrote a paper 15 years ago, which I wish I could say that I forecasted this, but it was more like a wish list. Like, here's what I really, really wish we could do. And so now we're sort of on the cusp of being able to do it. But we have several projects underway in collaboration with some of these guys where that's exactly what we'd like to do. I think there's much more individual variation than it's particularly in emotional experience and how it relates to behavior than we've been willing to acknowledge, in part because our scientific theoretical models treat variation like error, not like as if it's meaningful.
Individual difference is noise in any regression-based analysis.
Yeah, and it really requires getting away. It's not just getting new ideas, it's actually giving up the narrative structure of how we think people work.
And a different unit of analysis.
We got to wrap this up. There's this poor guy over here. I was going to give him a chance to ask a question. And we got to do it quickly.
My question was, I was wondering if real-time biofeedback was going to be the future of internal states, thus moving the needle in behavior change models. Do you think that real-time is going to be the key ingredient of our internal states and changing the way that we make decisions?
Yes, with the caveat that it depends on who, where, when, doing what. So part of what I'm not just being flip. So like with the electrodromal that I was showing you, that's just giving you one of the dimensions that Lisa showed you. I can't say anything about valence with this measure alone. So I don't know if I'm seeing a child that's increasing and decreasing, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing in his or her experience. So then what I need to understand is what is the context and what is the previous history in this context, and what can I observe that I can sort of overlay on top that would help me better interpret what the signal is. Now, to the extent that I could say, in certain places with certain people doing certain activities, there seems to be this X unit of probability that they're going to engage in this behavior, and it seems like X unit of time of that probability, arousal changes at this, not an absolute level, but some dynamic change seems to be one of the best predictors of what's going to happen. That's a wonderful application of biofeedback. And then the extent to which you can learn that and now have that individual come to realize what that feels like, and there's a word for that, or there's an activity for that, or there's a gesture that gets other people to help you accommodate in a way that they can't, I really think that could be transformative.
I think we're out of time, which is a pity because this turned out to be a lot more fun than I thought. This has been fantastic. And it's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much.